Today is part 4 of my series for beginning photographers who are new to the Olympus E-M10 Mark II, and today we're going to be talking about the shutter settings in your camera. So if you haven't seen part 1, 2, or 3 yet, it's okay. You can watch part 4 independently of those 3. We're not building on anything because mainly we're going to be talking about just one thing, the shutter settings in the camera. And the way I like to think about the different shutter settings, because there's multiple shutter settings and I'm sure it can be very confusing. At least it was for me when I was starting out with this camera. But I've come to love all of the different settings you can use in this camera, and it's one of the main reasons I switched over to using this camera exclusively for my professional work in real estate. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm going to do a little whiteboard and outline all of the different shutter settings and shutter modes, and then we're going to go into the camera and I'm going to show you how to set these things up in the menus so you can, maybe improve your workflow or be more creative or solve some general photography problems. And there's 3 main shutter settings, and I like to think of Olympus shutter settings in a 3x3 kind of way. Okay, because that's how it's set up in the menu. You have your 3 main shutter settings, which are the single shot, okay, mechanical, and then there's the sequential shooting, okay, which is where you push the shutter button and you hold it down and it'll take pictures as fast as it can. And then there is the self timer, right? So there's 3 different shutter settings that solve 3 different kinds of problems. You do single shot for landscape, street shooting, etc. You do continuous for sports action, and then self timers, for doing group shots or selfies or to reduce camera shake, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there are 3 shutter modes for each of those 3 settings. Okay, and I mentioned one. There's mechanical, which is the default setting for each of them, and then there is an anti-shock mode, and then there's also silent or electronic shutter. Okay, and again in that order for each of those first 3 settings we talked about. So let's go to the whiteboard and I'm going to outline it and then talk about the different sub-settings that you can use for each, and then we'll go into the menu and I'll show you how to set those up. Okay, so the first thing is we have, oops, I meant to hit this. The first one we have is single, right? The second shutter setting is sequential. And then finally we have the self timer. And then each of these 3 can work in 3 different modes. We have mechanical, we have anti-shock, wow, I'm not good at this whiteboard thing, and then we have silent. Okay, so each of these 3 can do any one of these 3, the default setting being single to mechanical or single shot mechanical shutter. Now, what are some of the sub settings for each one of these? Alright, if we look at single, there's really no sub settings for that. You push the shutter, it takes a picture. I mean, cameras have been doing that almost since they invented the shutter button, right? Now, on Olympus, they have the sequential settings. They have 2 different settings for that. They have a sequential high. Why am I having trouble with this? And then they have a sequential low. Okay, sequential high gives you a faster frame per second, meaning you can do between 5 and 8.5 frames per second, and I'm going to put in parentheses here 11 frames per second. And then sequential low lets you choose between 1 second and 4 frames per second, I'm going to put in parentheses here 5. So what's the difference between sequential high and sequential low? I mean, why not just have one sequential setting and then just change it from 1 frame per second up to 11 frames per second? Well, when you put the camera in sequential high, you're asking the camera to take the pictures as fast as it can, physically, mechanically, electronically. So there's some compromises there. And what are those compromises? Well, first, it's only going to acquire focus on the very first picture it takes out of the 8 or 10 frames per second that it's going to do. And second, it's going to calculate the exposure only one time. Okay, so those are the two main limitations, and a third one, and it's very minor, it doesn't work in anti-shock mode. But we'll list the two. So there's no continuous AF or autofocus, and there is no, and this is not a photography term I don't think, but there's no continuous exposure, so it's not recalculating exposure every time it takes a picture. So by eliminating these two things, it allows the camera to fire frames faster per second. And I see this in the forums a lot where people are like, I was shooting birds in flight and, at continuous high, sequential high, and all the pictures are out of focus. Well, that's because it only tries to acquire focus on the first frame. And then everything after that, if the bird moves out of the focal plane, it's not going to be in focus. So when you're shooting action where the subject is going to be moving in particular back and forth more so than left to right, you want to be in continuous low. And of course you're going to be at slower frames per second, but the camera will try to acquire focus with every single frame, and it will also adjust the exposure with every frame. And that's handy when, say, somebody's running from a shady area into a sunny area. The camera will try to recalculate the exposure so that it's not overblown or too bright or too dark, what have you. And personally my success rate has been like 50%, maybe less, in terms of being able to acquire focus on every frame. And same thing with exposure. That's what this camera is. It's about 50% for me. Some people can do a little better, some people maybe a little worse, but with a little practice, I was able to get about 50% hit rate for, subjects that are moving. Like I like to take pictures of my dog running, and I get probably half the frames or more in focus when I'm using continuous low with continuous autofocus. And I believe you can set the sequential low to be single autofocus, so it acts like continuous high, but I don't know why you would do that. If you're in continuous low, generally you want to be in continuous autofocus. So I'll talk about continuous autofocus or all the different autofocus modes in another module, but for today we're just going to be focusing on just the shutter settings. But these are the caveats when it comes to using sequential high versus sequential low. Okay, and then the self timer also has subsettings: 12 second, 2 seconds, and then custom. And custom can be set between a half a second, I think 30 seconds is the maximum. But it also has an autofocus option, and it can also do 1 to 10 frames. So what does that mean? Well, you can set the self timer to take a half a second up to 30 seconds between each frame. And you can tell it to autofocus for each frame, and then you can tell it to take between 1 and 10 frames. So it's almost like a mini, what's that called, time-lapse photography, but it's not designed to be a time-lapse, the time-lapse mode in the camera. And again, that's a whole nother video altogether. But this is really a very, very powerful feature in the self-timer, and this is the main reason I've used to switch to Olympus exclusively for my real estate photography, because I use this custom shutter a lot for bracketing exposures. it allows me to just push the shutter button one time, and then I tell the custom timer just to wait a half a second and to take 5 frames and a half a second delay between each one. And then I tell it not to try to autofocus between each one. But I have a video on one of my real estate jobs that you can kind of watch me go through that exercise. But there's probably lots of other creative ways to use the custom self timer, and so give that some thought. And we'll go into the camera and I'll show you the settings again of how those work. But yeah, that custom timer is awesome. Now, as I said in the beginning, these 3 main shutter modes or shutter settings can operate in any one of these 3 modes. And I have another video that talks about that at great length, about the difference between these different modes, the pros and cons, etc. So if you're interested in more detail on this, I recommend you go ahead and watch that one too. But for this video, I'll just talk about some of the limitations and uses for each of these modes. Now, when you're a mechanical shutter, it has a shutter speed range of 60 seconds up to 1/4000th of a second. Okay, and then when you're in anti-shock mode, it has a shutter speed range of 60 seconds to 1/320th of a second. And if your camera chooses a higher shutter speed, or you choose a higher shutter speed than 1/320th, it's going to default back up to the mechanical shutter. And anti-shock, basically what it's trying to do is eliminate any kind of internal vibrations caused by the shutter mechanism by introducing a little bit of a delay in between each shutter movement. And that reminds me, that's one other thing that continuous high speed or sequential shooting cannot do. There's no anti-shock mode available. Because again, anti-shock introduces delay into the sequential shooting. And continuous high obviously doesn't want any delay at all. Now, and then finally, there is the silent shutter, which will also operate between 60 seconds, is the longest shutter speed, up to a high speed of 1/16,000th of a second, which is really fast. And that can come in handy for different things too. Like I know a guy that shoots at 1/10,000th or 1/16,000th all the time when he's shooting drag racing, because he likes to capture the car's wheels being, they get really skinny when the wheels spin around. Or if you're in very bright sunlight, you have that option to go up to 1/16,000th of a second. Now, I mentioned here that the slowest shutter speed is 60 seconds, but there's also a shutter setting called bulb mode, and I have a different video on bulb mode, live time, live composite, all of that. Long exposure photography is really a whole different area. But standard shutter settings, 60 seconds is the longest that you can use. And that's pretty much it in terms of all of the different settings that you have available to you in the camera for your standard shutter settings. And the Olympus has organized the shutter settings in the camera exactly like this. And by that I mean the default setting is single shot, mechanical, so it always starts here. And then the next setting is single frame or single shot anti-shock, and then the next one is single frame silent. Okay, and then once you've exhausted that, the next setting is sequential high. And sequential high mechanical is the first setting. Remember, anti-shock's not available, so the next setting would be sequential high silent, which gives you that 11 frames per second. And when we go into the menus, I'll show you how to set that up. And then logically, there's sequential low, which is next. It'll do mechanical, it'll also do anti-shock, and it'll do silent. Once you've exhausted that, we go into the self timer, 12 seconds, mechanical, anti-shock, silent. And pretty much the same for the 2-second and the custom. You have these 3 modes available, and it goes in that order just like the previous 2 settings. So that's it for my whiteboard here. Let's go ahead and go into the camera and look at the super control panel first. okay, because that's really the easiest place to change the shutter settings. So we'll go into the Super Control panel, and you'll see right now it says right here at the top, single, and this tells you that it's in a mechanical shutter because there's no little icon next to it. And you'll see a little icon when you're in a different shutter mode versus, per shutter setting. So if I rotate the front dial to the right, you'll see the next thing that comes up. It says anti-shock, and there's a little diamond. So now we know we're an anti-shock mechanical shutter single. And then if I rotate it again, logically the next thing will be silent mode, single shot. Then after that we go into sequential high mechanical shutter, sequential high silent shutter. It skipped over the anti-shock. Then the next one is sequential low mechanical, sequential low anti-shock, sequential low silent. Then the next one is the self-timer, 12-second mechanical, 12-second anti-shock, 12-second silent. What's next? 2 seconds, right? Self-timer 2-second mechanical, 2-second anti-shock, 2-second silent. Then the next one is custom. Okay, custom timer mechanical, custom timer anti-shock, custom timer silent. And that's everything that was on my whiteboard. And since we've exhausted all of that, after that the next thing will be single shot mechanical. So it just rotates back to the beginning. And that's how you sort of go through every different shutter mode through the Super Control panel. Now you can do the same thing in the menu. Okay, so let's click the menu button and let's go up to shooting menu number 1, and we'll go all the way down here to the shutter settings. And right now you can see the default setting is single shot mechanical, anti-shock, silent, etc. It's in the exact same order, but it's just in a single column now. Okay, now let's talk about the let's go to the sequential high-speed shutter. Okay, and you can change this between 5 frames per second all the way up to 11 frames per second, and I'll show you where that is. It's not here in the menu, shooting menu 1. It's actually down here in the custom menu, and you go down here to release, and then you'll see the little continuous or sequential shutter icon there. And this is the sequential low frames per second, right? And you can see the default setting is at 4 frames per second, but if you click over to the right, you can change that between 1 and 4 frames per second. And then the next thing you have here is the sequential high frames per second mechanical shutter, and that can go between 5 and 8.5, just like it was on the whiteboard. But this is how you get the 11 frames and 5 frames per second. Sequential low silent shutter can go up to 5 frames now instead of 4. And then sequential high silent shutter, you can see, goes up to 11 frames per second. And that is significantly faster than 8.5 frames per second, especially when you're shooting several seconds in high-speed continuous shutter, right? Silent shutter. You'll get a lot more pictures. So I don't recommend using silent shutter because silent shutter has 2 really big drawbacks. Okay, one is you can't use flash when you're using silent shutter, which is a big problem for me because I always use flash in everything I do just about for my professional work. But the other one is rolling shutter. So again, watch my other video to kind of get a feel for what that is. But basically, if you're panning a shot and you're in high speed or low speed continuous shutter, or any shutter mode for that matter, if you're in silent mode, you're going to get rolling shutter where vertical lines start to tilt and you get that sort of distortion, and that kind of distortion is nearly impossible to fix in post-processing. I mean, so the shot is basically ruined because of rolling shutter, and that's why you hear a lot of reviewers talk about that or test for that, right? Okay, now let me talk about a couple other things in this shutter menu. You have something here called Release Priority Single, and this is for when you're in single point autofocus. Okay, and right now it's set to off. Well, what does that mean? Well, if it's on, okay, and it tells you very clearly the shutter can be released even when the camera is not in focus in S-AF or single autofocus. Okay, that's why by default this is set to off. So I leave this off because I want the camera to think it has focus before it takes a picture. And you notice I said the word think because we all know that by now at least the camera doesn't always acquire focus even though it thinks it has. You get that little beep, right? But I certainly don't want this turned on to where it'll just take a picture without getting focus first. And I do the same thing when I'm in release priority continuous autofocus. The default is on because they're trying to prioritize speed, like frames per second. But I turn this off as well in my shooting because again, I want it to acquire focus before it actually takes a picture. Okay. And then down here you'll see image stabilizer, which is, you know, what we all know it to be. It tries to stabilize the image, but there's one more here with the icon, the continuous sequential shutter icon. Image stabilization is on. I think the default is off. I just had it on in here, but the default is off. But I always turn this on as well because when it's off, it's trying to prioritize again frames per second. But if the picture is going to be blurry, I don't really want those extra pictures anyway. So I always turn this on for my, you know, when I'm out shooting. You know, your mileage may vary, but I'm just sharing with you what I like to do. And then the rest of these I don't really care about. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the sequential shutter and the settings and how to get to them. Now the only other thing left here is the self-timer custom settings, right? And you know, I think we talked about the 12-second. Let's talk about that for a second. 12-second timer, if I haven't already talked about this, you know, that's good for like you have your camera on a tripod, you're doing a group shot, so you push the shutter button. Let's do that one time. 12 seconds, right? It'll lock focus on somebody in the group, and then you have 12 seconds to kind of come around and be in the picture with everybody else. And there's a little light blinking here. It'll start blinking in the last couple of seconds to let you know that it's ready to take the picture, so everybody should smile. And that's the most common use, I think, for the 12-second shutter. There's also the 2-second self-timer, right? And this is useful for like macro photography or extreme telephoto photography, where you want to minimize the amount of shake that's created when you push the shutter button. Because you can see I'm just touching the shutter button and it shakes a little bit. Now if you're on a very sturdy tripod, 2 seconds is enough time. On this little dinky thing here, I would be in 12-second delay self-timer. But on a very sturdy tripod, you could use the 2-second delay with no problems. Okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about the custom timer now. And we'll scroll over to that. And we'll just do custom mechanical. It's the same for all the other modes. But you'll see that all these little things going on in here. But let's click the info button because you can see the info is highlighted on the screen. So if we click the info button, you can see I can change all these different settings. So the first one is the timer, and this is the delay after you push the shutter button before it takes its first picture. So I can set this to, by pushing the up arrow, looks like I can go up to 30 seconds. Okay, so I'll leave that at 1 second. And then you can tell the camera how many frames to take, and you can tell it in this mode, the custom timer mode, up to 10 frames. Again, it's kind of like a mini time lapse, and it's really, really handy. And then this is the interval. How many seconds between each shot do you want the camera to wait? So if it's taking 5 pictures, I can tell it to wait 3 seconds between each picture, you know, if I chose. And then finally, you can ask the camera to try to refocus every time it takes a picture. And normally I have this off because I'm just doing static shots of bedrooms and living rooms and things. But you know, autofocusing is available, and that's something you can do for like doing self-portraits. And again, I have a video on doing self-portraits using the custom timer. So check that out if you want to kind of get some ideas on how to use this feature creatively. Okay. And like I said, that's what's great about the Olympus cameras, is you have all of these options to solve different types of problems. But I think that's pretty much it. Again, thanks again for watching. Hopefully you found this helpful. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below. I really try to answer everyone's questions, and I'm sorry I haven't made a video in a long time. It's been a rough summer for me, both professionally and personally, but I'm going to try and start cranking these out again as I have more time now. And I appreciate all of the kind feedback I've gotten so far. You guys have been great, so thank you for that. But if you'd like to see more videos, go ahead and hit the subscribe button, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.